Good evening, everybody. My name is Roanne Smith, and I am the host of the Noble Company podcast. And we are a podcast that looks at contemporary topics in business, and we interview academics, entrepreneurs, and experts from around the world in topics of business. Now, first of all, I want to thank all of you who voted for me for the GainOnAwards.com. So here is my trophy. I am now the podcaster of the year for the People's Choice Award 2022. So I thank you so much for making that a reality. And I honestly didn't think it was possible, but you really came through for me. And so I am really, really, really grateful for your support. I'm really grateful to all who voted, all who come on every week, every month, to support the podcast. And I will continue to strive to give my best to offer the utmost quality for you, my audience, to enjoy. Now, today we are looking at the topic here, entrepreneurship through the lens of Caribbean women. And to discuss this topic, I have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Talia Esnard. Now, Talia is a PhD in sociology. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at the University of the West Indies, at St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. She's a researcher, and she focuses on issues of women, work, and organization, particularly within entrepreneurial and educational spheres. Now, Talia recently wrote a book, and actually that's the book that we're going to be discussing today. It's called Entrepreneurial Women in the Caribbean, Critical Insights and Policy Implications. And when I posted the information on this upcoming podcast, I made sure to put links to her blogs as well as to her website. So if at any point in time you want to go ahead and find out more information about her, well, you can check her out on LinkedIn at Talia Esnard. You can also check out her book in the links that I provided as well. So thank you so much, Talia, for coming. It has been a year in the making. I met Talia about a year ago. I wanted her on the podcast last year, but she wasn't able to make it. And so I'm really excited to have her today. Talia, would you like to say anything?
Well, I want to say first, congratulations on being the podcaster of the year. I think this is a reflection of the work that you are doing and the recognition of how you are impacting the space. So I think this is well deserved, and I want to say congratulations. I am very happy to be here. You're right. It's been a year, and very interestingly, it was a podcast on women entrepreneurs in the region. But I certainly could not make it then, but I am more than happy to be here this evening to have the conversation and to speak on the issue.
Perfect. Now, Talia, this book, the title is so interesting, and I had the fortune of having a conversation with you prior to this where I got some insight into the book. But can you tell the audience what the book is about?
Thanks for that. I think in a nutshell, the book is about how women are being lured into entrepreneurship. It's about the space, questioning of the space that is called the entrepreneurial space. It's about the recognition that what women are encouraged to get into may not necessarily be what they experience. But it's also about telling the story of what they think and how they respond when they get into that space, what they resolve or fall back on to navigate their own presence in that space, but it's also about the injustices that they also confront while they're in the entrepreneurial space, some of which are not new, but certainly it's very interesting how those injustices intensify when they become or attempt to engage in entrepreneurship. And I think more importantly, it provides very critical insights into the type of injustices that they face and raises very pertinent questions as to how entrepreneurship is being constructed and how the pathways for women to enter are being created, whether or not those pathways are adequate for women to function in a way that they see meaningful, and also what does it mean for us in terms of policy, in terms of framing specific interventions that are necessary to support those women when they enter into those entrepreneurial spaces.
Sorry, I was still muted. I said that's very interesting. And what were some of your motivations for doing this work?
Oh, that's it. As you know, it's someone asked me that recently, and I think I went back all the way back to my childhood. And I didn't recognize it at the time that I started this work. But what influenced me is deeply rooted in my own childhood. And it also reminded me of the women who spoke in as part of this work, that much of what they've experienced, their presence and how they see themselves, really are founded and rooted in their experiences as children. But to answer that question in a more direct way, I did a book in 2018 with a colleague of mine in University of South Florida on women in the academy and compared the experiences of women in the United States to the Caribbean. Very interestingly, when I did that book, we used a framework called intersectionality and really comparing the experiences of Black women across the two contexts, but noting the nuances of Black women who are from the Caribbean, who are working in the Caribbean, those who are from the Caribbean who have left to migrate to the US and are working in the US, and then those who are in the US and working as assistant, associate, or professors in the US. But much of that work prompted very critical questions around identity, experiences of Black women not seeing themselves as Black and not identifying with the racialization of self and how they have been constructed in the academic space. It raised many questions around race and how race is really coinciding and intersecting with gender to affect how they experience being an academic and how they promote themselves, how they position themselves, how they are able to navigate the academy and to grow to become scholars and to be successful in what they do. That work really prompted me to delve deeper into this intersectional realities that women face. And I saw this as an opportunity to extend work that I initially started in 2007 with my doctoral studies. And at that time, I looked at the entrepreneurial attitudes and orientations of students in higher education or in university, as we call it, recognizing at that time that entrepreneurship was not the buzzword that it is today, and that entrepreneurship is being pushed in such a way that it is now become the go-to, the desirable sort of activity and sort of framework for development in Caribbean context. I saw this therefore as an extension of my work on intersectionality, but really now reframing that and putting that framework to look at the issue of entrepreneurship in the region and the work that those women um, are really representing and what they're experiencing. And while doing that, I wrote part of that writing was about telling my own reflections, about sharing that reflection of why I am here. And I started, yes, with that understanding of my work as an extension of intersectional framing of entrepreneurship. But then I recognized that when I started to reflect, that there were aspects of this work that were already well grounded in my own experiences watching my mom, who was self employed from as much as I know. And I've watched her as a woman in her space. She was someone who started with a very small business, who got the support of her brothers, her siblings, her family, who was in some way, in many ways, a stalwart of the family, who was very resilient, who encountered many obstacles along the way. And many of those obstacles I have now differently reframed in my mind as intersectional obstacles. And those obstacles have framed her and have positioned her differently, that she's now able to share her own story with other women. And she's now mentoring other persons in this space to become, persons who aspire to start their own business or to think about being an entrepreneur. I think in many ways, as I started to reflect, I recognized that there are multiple points of motivation for me. So one is about my own professional space and where I started, looking at women and their experiences and how I theorize that in terms of intersectionality. But then going deeper, it was really about also recognizing that there are women who have made pathways for themselves, who are still struggling to do so, but who need that support. And some of that support, yes, could come from their families and persons that are very close to them. But I think it's also the responsibility of key institutions in our society to really address some of those injustices, the forms of discrimination that these women face. So, therefore, the work is, for me, an opportunity to voice, to give representation to those women who may not have the opportunity to, but to make their lives, their reality visible in ways that they could reframe how people are constructing them in the space, that they could create different pathways for themselves. They could redefine what entrepreneurship is or how entrepreneurship is being framed. And they could also present alternative ways to appreciate and to value what they're doing as well in this space. I hope that nutshell allows for some insights into the motivations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's really interesting to hear how your childhood really impacted, and watching your mother as an entrepreneur, how that impacted the way that you approach this work. Uh, Miss Joanna Bissett, she's saying hello from St. Lucia, and that it's very informative. And Talia, I know that you're from St. Lucia.
Very much so. Proud St. Lucian as well.
Yes. All right. Thanks for being
Good
here,
evening,
Joanna.
Joanna.
All right. So let's get into some of the key insights that you would have gained in your studies. Well, in your studies leading up to the publishing of the book.
So just once, just say that again. Sorry, I just missed that.
Sure. I said, so let's get into some of the key insights that you would have gained from your interviews when you talked with the different women and all your research leading up to the compilation of the book.
Yes. Oh, that's definitely one that I think I would like to leave as part of what the women have also shared with me. And there are quite a few of them, but if I could focus on three things, I think one is that women are saying as part of this work that gender matters. And I think part of saying that is important for them because they recognize that there's a lot of conversations, there are lots that has been written on what gender is. And for those women, they are saying that it's now become so much of a buzz that they don't think persons understand what they experience and take forward and attempt to change the challenges that they face while they are attempting to become entrepreneurs. And therefore, part of what they would like to leave as a message going forward and really as part of this work is that they are coming into the entrepreneurial space as women, but as women who are constructed in specific ways, as women who, when they get into the space, are questioned along gendered lines, questions that relate to how what they're doing as entrepreneurs or as entrepreneurs in the making are impacting their family, about whether their choices as entrepreneurs are negatively impacting who they are, how they are received, their marital relations, impacting their relationship with their children. Some women are also indicating that their involvement in this space is now being framed in such a way for them to receive that sort of shaming and blaming that their familial situations have suffered because of their engagement as entrepreneurs. And therefore, that guilt tripping as to how are you positioning yourself? Are you an entrepreneur? Perhaps. But if you are, just remember that you may also be a mother, you may be a wife. And therefore, how do you now balance that or prioritize certain aspects of that so that your role as mother and that bell, that reminder in the back that you have other responsibilities that are already being perceived as far more important than what you're doing or what you're aspiring to do as an entrepreneur. And therefore, it raises questions as to how those constructions of women begin to impact their own desires to be someone in that professional space and how it impacts their choices. And oftentimes, those women say that they make decisions that are more constrained because of those narratives, because of those conversations about who they are supposed to be, about the obligations they are supposed to meet, about how they're supposed to represent themselves, about the identities they're supposed to carry, and all the supposed about who they are is already impacting how they're presenting themselves in the space. So they are reserved, they are cautious, they are mindful, they go guarded. And in many cases, those women tell us that part of why they don't scale up from a micro to a small to a large is because their psyche has already been played on. They have grown to understand that who they are and what they are going or trying to be has to be measured against their own social, familial, moral responsibilities about how they reframed as women. And that I think is so important because when you continuously hear and are being told that who you are represents this, and that bubble becomes what you constantly hear, and it's resonating and it's repeated and then it's internalized, then your psyche become one that is already been shaped by the conversations that are playing in your ear over and over and over again. And therefore, that impact of how they're perceived and how they are constructed in society on what they're doing and how they perceive risk. And the women say that risk is not just economic risk, it's not just profit or loss, it's not how much you make and how far you go in the market. Risk has to be perceived in terms of what they do and how that impacts their relationships with their children, their families, their husbands, and even persons in the community. So that when we think about entrepreneurial risk and being innovative and creative, it's so important that we juxtapose that and situate all of those things as part of a wider understanding of how women are being placed and positioned in society. Let's be very broad and understanding from that perspective, but then how that macro understanding of who they are then go back to influence what they do in the entrepreneurial space. So that's one very big one. But the women are also saying that part of what they're doing and how they represent it and how they constrain and how they're perceiving risk is not just about gender. It's also about gender and race. It's about gender and color. And I distinctly remember this conversation with this young lady in St. Lucia who says to me that she's in the beauty sector. She wants to launch and diversify her products. She's making swimsuits. She wants to go into makeup. She wants to do a little bit of fashion. She wants to really go as and to become a serial entrepreneur. But what she's doing is very constrained by the fact that she does not want to attract a particular clientele because she doesn't want her sexuality to be a subject of conversation. She identifies as heterosexual, but she recognizes that if she discloses that identity, a sexual identity, as part of who she is in the market, then her position is going to be negatively impacted. But what she says is even more interesting. She says she has a colleague who is also identifying as heterosexual. who is in the business, who is doing similar sort of market segmentation and who's really trying to bring visibility to her product. And she has declared her sexuality. And she says the only reason why she's allowed to do this in the solution context is because she's what they call red skin, or in the solution parlance, she's shabin, very bright, clear skin complexion that allows her to have a particular social status and privilege that someone who may be heterosexual of dark skin complexion, but also a woman, may not receive the same response in the public eye. Oh, that's interesting. And therefore, what it tells us is that what she's doing as an entrepreneur, how she's constructing herself in that space, is not just about the activity and the economic activity that she's a part of. It's so much more than that. That is not part of the conversation about how entrepreneurship is being framed, about how women are being received as entrepreneurs in that space, and how they are creating pathways and creating and structures to support those women while they're in this space. And I don't know if you're going to pause here. I have another point, but I could pause and then allow for you to interject and come back to the third one.
Please, thank you so much. So, as it relates to the heterosexuality, I want you to go into that a little bit deeper, because I'm trying to figure out how that impacts on the beauty space, for example, how it impacts on swimwear, because I am not drawing the connection. So I just wanted to get a little bit more clarity on that.
So certainly. So again, her perspective, she has a very strong reservation about declaring her sexuality. Her reservation, her fear is built on understanding that in that specific context, homophobia is very strong. In that specific context, identifying as heterosexual has a certain intonation, has a certain sort of a negative connotation attached to it. That if she goes in that direction, she fears that her business is going to be impacted. In other words, the customers that she has secured as part of her clientele would scale back. They would be more reserved in terms of how they support her own ventures and how she's now going to be positioned in the market and whether or not she can grow or whether it will completely destroy who she is as a person and certainly that of her business.
Okay, thank you. We actually have a question. Actually, you know what? I think I'll go back to that question, because it takes us even a little bit further back, to what you mentioned before about your mom. So yeah, if you'll just continue on your other points.
I will. So the other point that I wanted to make was that of the issue of policy. Now, it's a very interesting, I think, part of that conversation because while entrepreneurship is being really flagged as the pathway for development for Caribbean societies and for developing countries, I think part of that conversation is a misunderstanding and a very loose interpretation of what policy could do in the current scheme of things for women who are being encouraged to enter into entrepreneurship. So, what I've recognized is that there are just about 4 different entrepreneurial policies across the region, Belize included in that. And I think Belize and Barbados have been quite advanced in how they are attempting to create policies that respond to the needs of persons who are in the entrepreneurial space. Belize and Barbados, to some extent Jamaica, have attempted to address the issue of gender and the challenges that women are facing within the entrepreneurial space. There's a little bit of that conversation in the Trinidad policy, but it's not very pronounced. But there's something much bigger than that, which is the policies that exist. There's no clarity, there's no consensus in terms of what entrepreneurship is and how it's been measured, the conceptualization of who's an entrepreneur and who's not. So there's disparities in terms of how we are all understanding this notion of entrepreneurship and who is an entrepreneur. There's also disparity in terms of how we are measuring entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And it differs based on income, based on the number of employees, based on the activity. It really differs based on the level of engagement that we see in the market. but there's a very clear statement that women who become involved, not necessarily in the policy, but women who become involved in entrepreneurship are usually in the informal sector. And for some reason, the policies do not respond to that level of informality in the sector, and why, in the very first place, women are resorting to informal activity to enter into that space, as opposed to entering into the formal spaces that are there for them to become entrepreneurs. That in itself is a question to be addressed through policy. But what is also very interesting is that when I delve into the policies and the methods for which these policies were designed, there is no clear indication that women who are deemed to be small or micro or medium sized entrepreneurs were actually included into the dialogue or into the conversations or consultations around what is needed in the policy. How do we frame entrepreneurial policies for the region? And more specifically, how do those policies address the specific circumstances of those women? And those women recognize that their voice, their stories, their realities are not neither captured nor is it addressed through existing policies for the region. And that is a serious gap for which needs to be rethought and re-engaged in ways that allow for women to think, to feel that they belong, that they are lured into. But when they are lured into, it's not because we want to count numbers and we want to make a difference in creating a pool of persons who are entering that space, but it's because they add value. They give insights, they create value differently, they bring a contribution that has to also be acknowledged and recognized in ways, both through the policies and through the type of support systems that are created for them.
All right, so thanks so much. Thanks so much, Talia. We have questions from Tao and Michelle. They're wondering if you meant to say homosexual rather than heterosexual, that the young lady was, she was homosexual and afraid of declaring her homosexuality.
I think in very specific terms, she identified herself as a lesbian.
Okay.
And she did not want for that to be declared because she was in what has been deemed as a heterosexual relationship, meaning that she's married, but she has those interests in the same sex, as we call it, and therefore she has indicated that just that inclination, the thought of those type of engagements are not to be declared, far less to represented in that space.
And then we have Giovanna. She's asking, what are formal and informal spaces?
Very interestingly, so women have been labeled as entering into informal spaces. So they're in very informal activities such as vendors and shopkeepers and retailers. And while those are not seen as typically entrepreneurial, they are seen in spaces that are not regulated. So let me be a bit broader in how I represent that. Spaces that are not regulated in such a way where they have to pay taxes, perhaps, or where they have to be part of a legislation that regulates what they do, how they report, and certainly how they are influenced by the circumstances and the specific conditions of becoming and being an entrepreneur in that space. Formality suggests that they registered, that they are paying their taxes, that they're reporting on their activities to a specific body, and that allows for monitoring to take place. Now, while that is important, I think what is even more important is an understanding of why the formal is not attractive and why the informal is the space that women are entering into with a specific ease that does not exist in the formal space.
Thank you for clearing that up. And I think that's really interesting because, you do find a lot of marginalized groups entering into the informal sector because of the challenges that exist with registering business, the same
Yeah.
taxes, and being able to um, survive while being able to enter into those informal spaces. Sometimes those formal spaces, those formal requirements are sometimes very prohibitive. And so when we think about marginalized groups, and then we talk about the fact that women actually fall into that space,
Yes.
I find that to be really interesting. Um, Another question I had was as it relates to the first thing that you spoke about when you talked about women um, who are kind of risk averse because they don't want to they don't want to be, what's the word, they don't want to be an outcast. They don't
Right.
want persons to think that they're not family oriented. They're afraid to be seen as too much, for
Yeah.
example. Um, how do you think that differs from women who have quote unquote formal careers and professions
Interesting. That's a very
or
interesting
employees?
question. Yes, very interesting question. So there's a broader discussion around work-life integration for women, and
Mm-hmm.
that discussion recognizes that once women are navigating these two domains, the work and the family life domain, that they will experience certain challenges. The difference between women who enter the 9 to 5 jobs is that they are there for a specific time frame, and they could opt out of their task once the 5 o'clock hits, right? Women as entrepreneurs, their times are not limited in that way. So they may be working until 7. They may require to go way beyond the hours that are deemed to be acceptable working hours in our understanding of it. They may have instances where they are not able to leave or attend to other business because there's a priority, there's a specific crisis within the business that they must address to at that point in time. And therefore, while there's a perception that entrepreneurship gives women some sense of flexibility, and it can, there are also certain contexts and parameters that require that they also invest extensive amount of time, effort, right, into what they're doing to make it successful. So that additional sort of requirement there makes it a very unique space, very flexible, very fluid, but for which also intensifies some of the tensions that women may experience if it is that there's a conflict around whether they are to align themselves more as a more familial or more entrepreneurial. And that is actually a reality for those women that they have to choose. Some of them have to choose. And most of them, because of the social pressures that they face, they choose to prioritize, in most cases, their family. And there are cases of women who are single parents. They also have it harder. They face greater challenges, and that moral bell that they have ringing, reminding them not only are you a single parent, but you're an entrepreneur, and therefore the risk that you face, the impact on your children, takes on a different message and a different sort of response from them. And they know that. They recognize that, and they are attempting to respond not just to being a single parent, but to being one who has already been damned by a society who has constructed single parenthood as something that is negative. But then when you are a single parent in an entrepreneurial space, that also carries with it an additional negative construction that these women also have to contend with.
All right, thank you so much for that. Um, we had a question from Jerry. Would you pull that up, please?
Just give
Okay,
me 1 second to add in my battery. Sorry about that.
no problem at all.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
The one thing that you should remember when you're on camera, right? To plug in your battery. But yes, I'm
It
here, and we have
happens.
a question for Jerry.
Yeah, so Jerry says, good evening. You made mention of your mom and her impact in shaping the developing you. Would you say parental support is a missing but valuable component to youth enterprise
Yes.
development? What are some of the specific major benefits derived from that parental support?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I love that, Jerry. Thanks for that.
It is.
Um, and it's it's interesting because I shared this very point with a colleague last week, and I made the point that when I grew up around my mom, I at that point in time I'm in a space where I am being constantly reminded of the importance of education, of moving forward. So they're very formalized conversations that are happening around, you know, what you need to aspire to as a young lady growing up. And one of the very clear ones was education. You must be very educationally focused, have your goals around education and build that growing up. But some of the things I think that are also informative, that are educational, but for which we do not recognize in our society, are those very messages that our parents are sharing with us that are not declared and stated in very explicit ways. So, my mother, for example, working those very long hours, working on her own, starting a business, going through the process of growing that, doing it alone for many years with the support of a younger brother at one time. Then he left, then she continued all alone. And all of this time, she's not saying in very explicit ways to me that it's about struggle, it's about resilience, it's about being persistent. She's not saying that to me, but her actions are saying it. So she's telling me, she's instilling those values in me that I would not have recognized in those years. But as I grew older and I reflected with the different insight that I have now on my own experiences watching my mom growing up, I recognized that I was raised by a very strong, determined, very clear and level-headed woman who had in her mind a pathway that she needed to pursue. She made clearance for her to actually go through that pathway, and she continues to do so. And I think for that, I recognize that there are points of learning that we access as human beings in spaces that we take for granted. And therefore, when we think about how children are raised by parents, there are moments of learning that are very valuable for children, for persons around us that we need to leverage on. And it's very interesting that when I interviewed those women, they said something quite similar. And that is, one particular lady in Barbados said to me that she grew up with her grandfather and her grandmother living in the same home. They were farmers. They were the ones who planted for self sufficiency, but then they moved from being self sufficient, doing farming just for the family, to going to the Saturday market and to selling that and their produce on the Saturday market and to meeting persons. And then they, they became known well enough to now transfer that service to a supermarket in the community, and they grew and it expanded to the point where they are now a well-known family business. But she said to me that when they were asking her to come onto the farm to help them to assist, at that point in time, she found it quite annoying. She did not understand neither the importance of what they were doing or what was being taught to her at that point in time. But she says, on reflection, in retrospect, she was being socialized to understand the importance of really being self reliant, being resistant, resilient, self seeking, self serving, but more importantly, of finding your own pathways to sustain self, to sustain family, and hopefully to enter into spaces of risk that could be profitable to you, both economically and professionally and socially. So that I'm suggesting that there are moments of learning that we are privileged to receive while we are in contexts and institutions of the family and other institutions that I think as a society we need to leverage on to understand that entrepreneurship is a way of thinking. It is a way of thinking that is taught through activities that may not necessarily seem entrepreneurial in the first place. And therefore, if we rethink entrepreneurship and see it as a way in which we engage others and in which we share those values and that type of thinking, then what we are inadvertently doing, if we are telling persons that to be entrepreneurial is not something that is that requires a specific sets of learning, a specific space, like in an education system or BSc or a master's or an MBA to become an entrepreneur. There are many entrepreneurs who learned to do what they are doing by experiencing risk, experiencing being innovative and being creative in what they do. I will tell you something. This young lady is now a successful entrepreneur in Barbados, and she's now engaged in ecologically friendly sort of jewelry making. She's using citruses, and she's now blending that into a different aspect of how she's representing um, her own products, and therefore she's sharing a message of being environmentally friendly and conscious as part of the product that she sells. And therefore her life journey, her childhood experiences has taught her more than entrepreneurship. It's taught her about the importance of the environment and how she could bridge the importance of the environment and sustaining the environment into the very entrepreneurial activity that she's also now doing. So that those moments are very important. And if as trainers, as the state, as government, as other entities that are pushing entrepreneurship, we recognize that we can leverage on very simple moments of learning. I think that our agenda around really teaching our society to be more risk-taking and innovative and creative, it will not seem as a task, as something that people are struggling really hard to do, but something that they already naturally socialized to do and to become.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. The question and the answer. And, you know, even while you were talking, I thought about, yeah, the simplicity that you were talking about and just, learning from others around you, whether it be your parents, your grandparents, other persons in the community. And we do, as a society, put great emphasis on academics as the outlet through which we can learn about entrepreneurship. And I think it discourages persons a lot, because even when you talk about scaling up, there's some persons that don't think that they can scale up because they don't have the education to do it, when truthfully they have the wherewithal in terms of maybe the background through their family, the social support, um, and sometimes that's all people really need, outside of the same policy that you would have spoken about, these policies that need to be put in place to support
Exactly.
the development of entrepreneurship, to support the development of these businesses, so that they can move from the informal sector to the more formal sector, where they can benefit from, um, different types of funding initiatives, for example, social security, that kind of thing. All right, so thank you so much for that. Then there's the fact that you interviewed women across the Caribbean. So I'm sure that there's a lot of insight you have into the differences and the similarities between the experiences of women across the Caribbean. So would you like to share that with us?
Yes, and that's part of the comparative work, and that's part of what intersectionality allows for you to do. But essentially, I interviewed women in Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia, Trinidad, St. Kitts Nevis, and there's work that is continuing with women in Guyana, and the work is really mushroomed. I will tell you that this work is and was a 5-year project, because many of those interviews were face to face. The pandemic changed that for me, and I think also for the women, because it meant that they had to do things differently. But what was very clear in doing the comparative analysis is that we cannot use a very broad brush approach to understanding women in the Caribbean, and what entrepreneurship means for women across the Caribbean. I would tell you, for example, of one young lady I met. She's of Portuguese descent. She's her family, her grandfather was a Portuguese who came into the region very early. And then she says to me that while she has that experience of growing up in a Portuguese home, and there's that perception that as an ethnic group that they are prone to become entrepreneurs, that she did not receive the support that she expected, for example, in the entrepreneurial space, and she did not get the resources, financial and otherwise, to grow her business. And in lieu of that, she was told, you have to do it on your own. And we had this very long conversation around, is it part of this individualistic sort of framework that is made as part of what we are exposed to more and more within this context? Or is it that culturally those values and practices have died? And she said it's a little bit of both. And I found it very interesting that her context and her situation was not the same. And that ethnic value system and practices that she referenced did not exist for women in St. Lucia, for example, or for women in Jamaica. And it's very interesting, too, that women in Trinidad seem to be driving towards entrepreneurship as an opportunity. But in Jamaica, it for them, it emerged more as a necessity based on the socioeconomic conditions that they were facing at that particular point in time. In the case of St. Lucia, it was a little bit of both, with the necessity and opportunity-based sort of entrepreneurship. But even the realities around the challenges that they faced were very different. Women in Barbados, for example, very often cited the role of the state and the work that the government has done over the last couple of years in supporting entrepreneurship. But they reminded me that very, very strong value systems about religion, about gender, about race are still very clear. They were of the opinion that there are two separate markets in Barbados, one for the locals that are supported by the foreigners and by the locals themselves, but there's a classed market. And by classed market, I mean the market where you have the whites and very high class individuals really just accessing the jewelry, the very high end products, and the different sort of access points that they create in those markets. And she said that it's very clear that even though there's a class aspect to this, that there's a different response that she receives from persons who are foreign based as opposed to local based. So that there's a perception that local entrepreneurs are not supported within the space that they occupy. And she was very clear. She said, I don't know if it is that it's a case where we don't support our own. It's a case where there's too much competition, and that, or there's a devaluing or undervaluing of what is local. But she says there's so much that has been done about buy local campaigns, for example, in Barbados. So she cannot think that it's the fact that they don't understand the importance of doing local and being part of that local promotion. She thinks it's a much wider issue around how persons are constructing women and Black women in that space. But that story, interestingly, is also reflected in the work, for example, of Selwyn Ryan, who wrote about Black entrepreneurs in Trinidad and Tobago, and who also raised issues and who shared in his work that they also had the perception that they were not supported by other persons in the local sector. So that there are comparative differences across the different islands, and that the women are reporting very strong differences around how they're perceived, the different axes of power that they face, whether it be race or class or color or gender. St. Lucia had a very strong color bias with gender and color. And that was not the case, certainly, that I saw, for example, in St. Vincent. It was a little bit of the case in Jamaica. But those issues that they're facing about the perceptions and the constructions of themselves in the market, none of that is represented in the policy. There's no intervention that exists across the Caribbean that recognizes the ways in which women are differentiated, distinguished or even discriminated upon based on those axes of power, whether it be race or class or color or gender. Nothing in our current context addresses those issues. And I want to say that those are societal issues that are with us. They've been with us for a while. They're changing over time. But that does not mean that we are to take for granted how those forms of power are impacting our citizens and our women who are trying to find ways to be more resilient and to support their families, as many of the cases are. So therefore, I think it's important to recognize that there needs to be a more nuanced understanding of the context, our Caribbean context, and that understanding has to be a social one, not just an economic one. We must understand how our society is highly stratified, highly structured, and there are many constructions that we form and carry around being and becoming successful, whether it is through education, whether it is through entering a formal establishment as a kind of work. But those constructions, I must say that those women are pushing back against them. They are saying that they cannot and they will not allow those constructions to define who they are and what they can become. And therefore, those women were actively involved in refining and redefining how they represent themselves. They saw issues of peace, autonomy, happiness, giving as critical to becoming entrepreneurs. Those, those representations of what entrepreneurship means is not valued in how it is presented in the text, in policy, in terms of how it's been encouraged as an activity. But they're saying that when we speak about sustainable development, for example, we cannot go forward thinking that sustainable development is all about engaging in an activity to bring money, to be recorded by profit and loss. They are saying that sustainability is also about, yes, making profits, but it's about mental health. It's about well being. It's about self care. It's about having the ability to be flexible and to make decisions that are meaningful, not just for the entrepreneur, for her family, for the community, and finding peace in that contribution that they're differently making when they enter the entrepreneurial space. That understanding and recreation of what entrepreneurship can be, the creativity, the innovation, the contribution, the social value that they add into that space needs to be appreciated differently.
Thanks so much. That actually really resonates with me as somebody who has done research with, again, marginalized communities, and I see how they do not want to be represented as a monolith. Unfortunately, there are labels put on these groups, and persons expect these groups to, every person in the group to operate the same way. And
Yes.
unfortunately, these labels do not allow for marginalized populations to actually be able to self-actualize, to be able to be able to actually take advantage of opportunities that would otherwise be available for them if those nuances were actually really considered. And when you talked about the Portuguese lady and the support that she does not get, again, in our society, often when we think about certain groups of people and that same intersectionality with race, we think that they always have it easy. You know, the resources are always made available to them. But if I'm understanding you correctly, in some spaces, in some contexts, that can actually work against you because there's some
Exactly.
support that you're not going to get because persons automatically assume that you can sustain your own business, that you can fund your own business. So that is actually, that's a really big takeaway for me from this, that, you know, we cannot look at women when we're setting policy, we cannot look at them as a single group. And that's why it's so
Exactly.
important to have like diverse perspectives. And when we talk about diverse perspectives, not just having one woman in the room, but maybe having a Black woman, a white woman, women of different religions, so that we have different perspectives on women in entrepreneurship and how women are affected by entrepreneurship. So thank you for that. Then you started to address some of the gaps. You addressed the fact that there's not the policy that really across the board speaks to the needs of women. Women's voices aren't heard in making a policy. Are there any other gaps that you care to discuss? Did you miss that, Talia, or did
I missed that? I lost connection.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So what I was saying is that you started to talk about some of the gaps. When we talked about women and not being included in the making of policy, for example, are there any other gaps that you would like to highlight briefly?
Certainly, I think a big one for those women are the training gaps. And that for them became very clear in the pandemic, because many of them had to rethink the market and rethink how they engage the market. They lost access to seeing their clients face to face based on the measures that were imposed during the pandemic. And therefore, they very clearly and very quickly had to shift to online and to being as part of this virtual space. But they had absolutely no clue as to how to make that transition. And many of those women who were perhaps 40 and above were very much challenged in terms of how do they make the transition into the online space and to set up accounts and a PayPal account, for example, to receive payments. But those of them who did, for example, indicated that when they shifted from the physical to the online space, that the market quadrupled, that their clientele increased, that they were selling to places, not just in Trinidad and Tobago or in Barbados and just 2 or 3 clients in the region. One particular lady said to me she moved from selling to clients in Barbados and to exporting to Grenada and St. Vincent to also now exporting to women in the US and in Canada. And she has clients who repeatedly seek additional supplies through, just ordering and having those items shipped, so that she has now entered into a space where she could now hire someone to handle that aspect of the business for her and think about growing other parts of the business that she had left behind for some time. So therefore, the pandemic opened for her new ways of doing differently and taking more risk. But like many other women, she said, I don't know how to prevent the hacking. I don't know how to safeguard my business while I'm on individual space. I don't know how to respond to certain technological challenges that I'm having while I'm there. So the issue of technology, the understanding of the digital space, of the digital transformations that need to happen to really allow women to engage differently in the wider global space is one that needs to be addressed. So there's a training gap for them on a very basic level around learning about entrepreneurship. And while in Trinidad and Tobago, you have the netcos and you have other different entities that are affording women the opportunities to access those types of training, it's really about having the skill sets. And we have to move away from very formalized types of training where we have to get a first degree or an MBA to become an entrepreneur, to giving more micro credentials, for example, that allow for women to develop those skill sets very quickly and be able to implement those into what they do. That sort of micro credentialing, very short term engagement in training opportunities is what they are asking for right now to make a difference in terms of what they're doing in the market. And I think that's a call to universities, a call to respond and to engage those women in the market differently, to partner with them in ways that allow them a certain level of readiness and allow for them to do things in a quicker time frame than they are able to do right now. So the issue of Technology, access to technology, that's also a very big one. The women are indicating that they do not also have the networks that are necessary to sustain them while they are into this space. And that I think is an issue that has to be addressed. How do we create networks of support that sustain not just the economic activity of those women, that build the confidence in what they do, that really reminds them that they are making a contribution, that acknowledges that, leverages on that, and build on that. That type of networking with support structures, with messages, and a sort of appreciation of who they are and what they're contributing to is certainly a gap that needs to be addressed in the entrepreneurial space if we are to allow women to feel that they belong and that what they do is making a contribution.
Perfect. And Giovanna Barrow says, love that, a micro credential. I've actually never heard that terminology before, but I do like it and it makes complete sense. Because I really do think that sometimes we as societies go overboard in what is required in order to achieve. And I think that's changing a lot, though. I think that there are a lot more people realizing, you don't need to go the full way in terms of academics, but, you can do these short courses, especially with the introduction of Coursera and those other kind of online courses, which allow women to, or people in general, to be able to get the training that they need, and many times for free. So that's really good. And I know in Barbados, I think it's through the National Training Institute, that there's been a lot of, there's been a big push toward using Coursera as a way to upskill. So definitely that's something that we're seeing in Barbados for sure. So just to kind of wrap up, what are some of the key words that you would like persons to remember around your work?
I want to answer that, but before I do,
Mhm.
Joanne, I just wanted to, Ruan, sorry, to say something. I'm an academic
Mhm.
by training, and
Yeah.
therefore I don't want to allow persons to take away this evening that the academics are not important. They are important. I think it's around having persons understand that if they're taking certain educational routes, then where would those lead to? So, for example, if I want to become a scholar, a lecturer, an academic, I take the route of the first degree, the master's, the PhD. But if I want, for example, to become an entrepreneur, there are options. There are options in terms of either doing a first degree if you would like to do that, or access more short-term training, including, for example, as I said, leaning on the micro credentialing that you could build and scaffold and leverage on that to actually enhance what you're doing. But so I want to say that academics are important. Following that academic stream is important, but the importance of that, it depends on your journey, on where you would like to see yourself. In the entrepreneurial space, there are many options available, I think, for which we can encourage persons to access. So that's one I wanted to clarify. But in terms of your question, what would I like to leave with people as words that describe this book? Power would be the first one. I want to suggest that we as human beings, we are driven in many ways by power structures, whether it is in our broader society, whether it's through the institution, whether it's through discourse or language. Power guides what we do. And therefore, we need to recognize that those structures, and I call them power structures, those power structures are simple things like how women are defined based on gender, how our perception of who we are racially matters, how we're positioned in the market is also going to depend on our ethnic background, our family name. Those are power structures. It'll be those things by which people define us by which persons use to place us in particular positions in society, by which persons use to constrain what we do and how we are constructing ourselves in certain spaces. Those are power structures. But I want us to remember that while there may be power structures that are all around us, we need to be persistent and resilient and give voice to who we are and how we construct ourselves in that space. Recognizing that negative power has the ability to devalue people's perceptions of themselves, to denigrate, to destroy. And unless we have a consciousness and a valuation of who we are in that space and persons to support who we become, then we become vulnerable to those power structures. So I want to leave with you that word power, the importance of responding to power by having a clear mind, being persistent, and having a consciousness that both recognizes those power structures and the need to respond with confidence and voice. I also want to leave the word public policy. The state has an obligation to support the citizens of the region. And while we are to have a consciousness that allows for us to move forward as people, the state needs to support. And in creating support, we need to revise public policy that supports and builds and promotes entrepreneurship, to recognize that there are certain persons, vulnerable groups in our population that do not and are not receiving support. We need to promote issues of diversity, inclusion, and we need to recognize that a lot of what we do comes from our everyday spaces, the farm, the home, and recognize that there's a certain level of indigeneity in that. There's a certain level of what we do that is rooted in the very spaces that are ours, that we create. We are recreating on an everyday basis. And therefore, we have the power also to reconstruct, to deconstruct. We have the power also to reframe, to represent ourselves differently in that space. But we also have the power for us to leave with public policy makers that we are important as entrepreneurs, that women and the experiences matter, and that different measures are needed to value the contributions of women while they are in that space. So if I could repeat those again, it's about power, persistence, resilience, consciousness, public policy, and voice.
Perfect. All right. And final question. What do you see as some of the next steps following up from the publication of this book?
Thank you for that. So the next steps for me would be doing what is happening now. Sensitization is important. Oftentimes, I have colleagues, I have friends who remind me that the university has a function, but that while we are responding to the function and creating knowledge, we also have to disseminate those in ways for the public to identify with, to relate, to grow from. So part of my work going forward is about bringing those sensitizations to different groups of people, including different institutions, critical stakeholders, the bankers, the lenders, the public policy makers, the academics, those stakeholders who could make a difference at one end of that spectrum, but also about raising the consciousness and bringing visibility to the lives of those women, and to remind them and to encourage them and to provide support through the voices and experiences of other women, to remind them that they too could make that difference. They too could get that visibility and that recognition that they are already working towards. So that it's about sensitization, it's about really deepening the conversation, but it's also about seeking justice for many of those women whose voices have been silenced in this space.
Thank you so much. And if we just go to the comments, we're getting some really good feedback. Curtis, if you'll just pull up. Tony says, amazing and inspiring. Michelle says she's an entrepreneur and she's also pursuing a BSc in business management. All the best to you, Michelle. Michelle is also from St. Lucia, by the way. Jerry says, excellent conversation. Continue best. And as usual, Jerry, thanks for coming in and contributing. Gia Chandler says, this is very thought-provoking. I'm glad that you thought so, Gia. Sophia says, excellent presentation. I agree, Sophia. All right, perfect. Now, with all the feedback that I've been getting, you can see why I have been waiting for an entire year for Talia to come on to this podcast. She is smart. She is impressive. She has a lot to offer in terms of value as it relates to the challenges that women face, not only within the entrepreneurial space, but like she would have talked about in terms of academia and just general work in organizations. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come out and speak with us this evening. I definitely would like to have you back on to talk a little bit more about this, as well as to get some more information on how you've progressed and how certain policies have progressed as a result of the work that you have done, because I'm pretty sure that anybody that listens to this will feel empowered to do more. I certainly am empowered to do more. I'm encouraged, and I'm hoping that the right persons will hear and will take heed as it relates to bringing diverse perspectives and voices to policy making surrounding this issue. So thank you so much, Michelle. Michelle says thank you. Spaces like these are very needed. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And
Thank you, Michelle.
so Talia, thank you once more to my audience. Thank you so much for coming out and for your continued support. And we will see you again next month. Just keep your eyes on this space. You can check me out on LinkedIn. You can look for me on Facebook as well, at Sanderson-Smith School of Business. Same on YouTube. On LinkedIn by my name, Roanne Smith. And you can just link with me there, connect with me, and you can be kept updated on all of the episodes that we have coming up. And that's it for tonight. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Until next time.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
All right.